let's never forget those wonderful men and women that gave their lives for America, that we might live in freedom. And they fought our wars. They gave their lives. And we honor and remember them today. Let them in, Peter. They are very tired. Give them couches where the angels sleep. Light those fires. Let them wake whole again. Brand new dawn, fired by the sun, not wartime's bloody gun. May their peace be deep. Remember where their broken bodies lie. God knows how young they were to have to die. God knows how young they were to have to die. Give them things they like. Let them make some noise. Give dance hall bands, not golden harps, to ease our boys. And let them love Peter, for they've had no time. Should have trees and bird song, hills to climb, the taste of summer in a ripened pear, and girls sweet as meadow wind with flowing hair. Tell them how they are missed, but say not to fear. It's gonna be all right. When we get there, let them in, Peter. Let them in, Peter. Let them in, Peter. Hey, happy 4th of July. This is a sad 4th of July for me because I love this nation and I'm heartbroken at what's happening to it as it's being torn apart by anarchy and hatred. It's just so difficult to watch. So this isn't my normal kind of sermon thing. I just want to talk to you heart to heart about some simple things about America. We have to remember how it was perceived. How'd they come up with this, in other words? How did they get these ideas? How is it preserved? How is it perpetuated? Let's talk about it for just a few minutes. How did our founders come up with the idea of personal freedom and liberty like this? The world had never known this before. Sure, the Greeks had a democracy, but, still, the people didn't have freedom like we had, this representative republic that we live in. Where did they get this? Well, I'll tell you where it began. It began in the 1500s. There's a thing that happened called the Reformation, where there was a bunch of people who were all parts of the Catholic Church who were sick and tired of the Catholic hierarchy running them because they were so corrupt. The Pope at the time was nuts. They had confused the gospel and shrouded in a bunch of church rigmarole. They were selling indulgences. That means that if you gave enough money to the church, you could have all these free sins and do a bunch of crazy stuff and still get into heaven, and all the just. It was crazy. You should read about that time, a very, very pivotal time in history, because these group of men, that would be Luther and John Huss and Zwingli in Switzerland and several across Europe said, no, we want to reform the Catholic Church. Well, they wouldn't be reformed, and so they became Protestants. They protested. They pulled out. And they chose that they would be ruled by the Scriptures Scripture alone was their mantra. Instead of this corrupt hierarchy in Rome, they're not going to do it. And that's the beginning of the rumblings of a free government, of freedom and liberty. They said, we're not going to do it. They paid a great price for it too, but they did it. And then about 200 years later, the colonies were formed. And the colonies in America, and when they were formed, these people grew together as a group. There was a unity among them because they were so far away from the mother country. These Americans were rugged individualists. And of course, the abuse of England, King George III, taxation without representation and all those kind of things, they were getting very tired of it. And they were unified in that way. And then in 1739, a young man by the name of George Whitfield showed up. And he was an interesting guy. He was slightly built. He was cross-eyed, but he had one of the greatest preaching voices and content. He was one of the great preachers of the English-speaking world, probably the greatest that I'm aware of. And he preached in the colonies for years. He traveled on horseback to all 13 colonies on horseback through the American wilderness. He traveled more thousands of miles on horseback than any other person in colonial America. He preached 12,000 sermons, gave 12,000 lectures, more than that, but about that number. And he brought this message to the people of the colonies that in Jesus, there was neither male nor female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. And you know what that was? It's an equality that the world had never realized. And of course, the apostles wrote about it 700 years before, 1700 years before this. But for some reason, it came like it opened up to the people in the colonies that we're equal. That means if I'm a laborer, I'm equal to the king, to the elites. And as far as Whitfield goes, and the preachers in New England, they also talked about the sin of slavery and the sin of the way the American government was treating the Native Americans. They're preaching that all people were equal. Whitfield preached this stuff. Women, it eventually brought about the abolition of slavery and the women's suffrage movement. Those were all Christian movements. When they wrote our Constitution, they said in order to form a more perfect union, they didn't say perfect, they said a more perfect union. They set in motion this form of government that would right its wrongs. It's a beautiful thing. They perceived this thing, but it was because of Whitfield's preaching. He unified the colonies. Benjamin Franklin was a big fan of this young man, Whitfield. And even though he never became a Christian, he was a deist and he never believed that Jesus was God. But he was amazed at this kid's preaching. He was 24 when he showed up. He died here when he was 51. But anyhow, 24, he's preaching, and it's life-changing to people. And because of the gospel of Jesus, and these people were coming to Jesus, they were unified as a people. They were equal and they were unified. It was a perfect setup for the American idea, because these people chose to rule themselves by the scriptures. This Whitfield kid, he was cross-eyed. He had to be in fact, the pictures of him are a little bit comical. And they made fun of him, but his powerful preaching developed the idea of America. And the thing about Whitfield, he is called the father and the patron saint of the American Revolution. His preaching turned it all around. Let's talk about, secondly, preserving this incredible nation in which we live. The idea of personal freedom and liberty. How is it preserved? Okay. There's only a few ways that this is preserved. Personal freedom doesn't mean doing whatever I want to, or doing whatever weird sexual thing I want to do with my body, and then force you to say that it's okay and normal, or natural, or healthy. That's not what freedom is. Freedom isn't the freedom to do what you want. It's the freedom to do the right thing. So what I want to say is this: to preserve America, there has to be virtue. That means doing the right things. Ever heard of the 10 Commandments of God? They're not suggestions, right? They're not suggestions. When they wrote the Constitution, they wrote a 5-volume set of books. The founders did, called the Federalist Papers, and James Madison wrote that this form of government is only meant to rule a people who rule themselves by the 10 Commandments of God. Our society has fallen so far morally. And it is only the gospel of Jesus Christ that causes someone to become moral, in a sense that they're virtuous and they can be a wonderful help to the American society and for the preserving of this freedom. If everybody just runs wild like we are right now, we all try to create rules and laws to control everybody's behavior, and it's a total loss of freedom. Francis Schaeffer wrote about it back in the 70s and 80s. And so virtue is so important. Another thing that's so important is personal responsibility. Now look, there's a lot of things being said right now. The killing of Mr. George in Minnesota was awful. And the system is going to work. The system is going to punish the police officer that murdered him. But there's this problem, and the problem is, no matter where you came from, in order for America to be preserved, this wonderful idea to be preserved, each of us has to take our own personal responsibility. It was the Apostle Paul that when he was writing to the Thessalonians, listen to this, will you? Listen to the Bible's idea of personal responsibility. Writing to the Thessalonians, Paul writes, "For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling so that we would not be a burden on any of you. We did this not because we do not have the right to such help, but in order to make ourselves a model for you to follow. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: if a man will not work, he shall not eat." Boy, that's not very popular right now, is it? I just want to say this to you. If you think that the history of America has somehow deprived you of opportunity, you're going to be a victim for the rest of your life. And the only way you're ever going to get out of this is you'll take your own responsibility for your own actions and for your own well-being. I mean, the Bible just puts it plainly. Work. Make your own way. You can do this. But if you're going to talk about things from hundreds of years ago or 50 years ago that somehow were unfair, and of course slavery and on Jim Crow and all that was so awful. It's a terrible sin on the history of America. But it was dealt with. You gotta pick yourself up. You've got to move on. You have to. There are some pretty incredible songs written about the condition of our inner cities. One was written by Chris Knight. It's called "Send a Boat." And the third verse is this: "The writing's on the wall. There are bruises on his face. Daddy's come and go. Mama's on a date. He's just cold and hungry. Playing ain't no fun. If he ever grows up, he'll get himself a gun. Someone's crying in the hall. Oh, Lord, help us all. As we try to stay afloat, if you would, Lord, send a boat." Our inner cities are a mess. And let me say this. They're not a mess because of slavery or Jim Crow. I know it's controversial. I'm not trying to be offensive. What has happened is the government has made certain groups of people in the inner city, white and black, dependent on the government. And they never get off that plantation. They just are locked into this forever and can never go anywhere because they have a victim mentality. And now the idea of reparations and all of that being paid, for the sins of slavery, all that does is create more victims. Listen, don't stay there. You're way smarter. You have way more ability than you know. God will help you to become responsible for yourself. Let me tell you about the Hamptons. The Hamptons are from Missouri. My grandfather, Herbert, they called him Shorty. He was shorter than 5 feet. Towering man. He was a sharecropper and not a good one. It was during the Depression. They were starving to death. Smartest thing he ever did, other than marrying my grandma, is moving to Michigan and getting a job with General Motors. My dad was 5 years old. We just lost him at 90. He would have been 91 last year. He was 5 years old when they moved here. That's the only reason they survived. We wouldn't even be having this conversation if it wasn't for General Motors. Thank God that Grandpa got a good job. And they worked hard. And then my dad, who was never very good at school and was kind of an angry young man, he met this girl named Margie, and they got married in 1950. And these two kids worked like dogs and lived on less than they made. And they had 3 boys, and they disciplined those little suckers and made them toe the line and made them be respectful and to respect women and to love the country and to be a positive influence in the world in which you live and all that stuff. And, they didn't have big educations or any of that. But they raised 3 boys. Listen, no matter where your background, no matter where you're from, you can move ahead. You can become personally responsible, and you can have the courage to stop blaming other people for your situation and move on. If you want to preserve this great nation, it has to be virtuous. We have to be virtuous as a people. We have to do what God says, and we have to become personally responsible. We have to do it. It's important. So that's how it was perceived. That's how it's preserved. But how is it perpetuated? I want you to realize something about people. That minds can only change when hearts change. Let me read this to you from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning at verse 3. Paul says, "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age," that's how he refers to Satan sometimes, "the God of this age blinded the minds of unbelievers, so they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,'" that's in the creation, of course, "made the light, his light, shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." Do you want to know how people change? Minds change when hearts change. You want to know how hearts change? When the light of the gospel enters those hearts. God is the only one that can open hearts and change lives. The most important thing an American can do is turn back to God. I know a bunch of preachers are saying that stuff, but I just want to tell you it's true. Because the only way we become virtuous is if we're forgiven. And the only way that we do the right thing is if we realize how deeply we are loved by the living God, so much that he would send his own son to die for our sins and be raised from the dead to prove that it's true. He loves you. And we can perpetuate this by realizing that it's God who's got to change hearts and minds. So this November, we're coming up on this big election everybody's fighting over right now. Work for your candidate. Fight for what you believe is right. That's good and a great thing. What a great opportunity in a world to be able to have a voice like this. But realize something. People need the Lord. And the Lord's the one that will change hearts and perpetuate freedom and liberty in America. So God bless you all. Hang on. Keep loving people. Don't get cynical during this time. Love people and keep working for the common good. And God bless America. Talk to you next week. If you guys need anything, go to cbcmi.com. You can make a request there if you need anybody to run for groceries or prescriptions or anything for you. Okay, God bless you all. And I'm still around. If you can email me at revtomhampton@gmail.com or through the website if you'd like to talk. Okay? Thank you for listening. If you would like to support Community Bible Church, we would appreciate your prayers and gifts. We can be reached at Community Bible Church, 1888 Crescent Lake Road, Waterford, Michigan, 48327, or at our website, www.cbcmi.com. We'd appreciate your gifts. We know that many can't give right now, so if you would, you'd be a great blessing to your brothers and sisters. God bless you. Have a great day.